The divine separation, how God intervenes to remove you from the grip of a narcissist. The spiritual protection that comes when God answers prayers for deliverance. Recognizing separation as both an act of mercy and justice. You know, it's a strange thing when you realize that what you thought was love, what you thought was loyalty, was actually a trap. You wake up one day after years of bending yourself out of shape, after twisting your soul into knots trying to please someone who could never be pleased, and you finally see it. You see that you weren't dealing with just a difficult personality. You weren't dealing with someone who had bad days or a temper. You were dealing with something darker, something parasitic, a narcissist. And here's the most frightening part. You didn't escape them because you were clever enough or because you suddenly found the strength on your own. No, that's the illusion the ego wants to believe. You escaped because someone far greater than you intervened. There's a moment, if you've lived this, where you recognize that it was not your hand pulling you out of that pit. It was God's hand. Now, people underestimate that. They think separation is just two people drifting apart or one person finally setting boundaries. But when God steps in and separates you from a narcissist, it doesn't feel like a negotiation. It doesn't feel like you just outgrew them. It feels like a violent tearing away. Because make no mistake, that bond, however toxic it was, ran deep. They had their claws in you. And they don't let go willingly. They hold on with manipulation, with guilt, with fear, with every trick in the book. But when God decides enough is enough, those tricks don't work anymore. It's like the scales fall off your eyes. You stop believing the lies that used to trap you. Their charm suddenly looks grotesque. Their flattery sounds hollow. Their threats lose their sting. It's as though you've been under a spell and suddenly the spell is broken. That's not human willpower alone. That's divine intervention. And what's interesting is that this separation doesn't just free you. It exposes them. When God removes you, the narcissist loses the mirror they've been using to reflect their fake image back to the world. Because you were the one propping them up. You were the audience to their performance, the witness to their false greatness, the one they drained to keep their hollow lives afloat. And when you're gone, suddenly the spotlight dims. They're left alone with themselves, and that's their greatest nightmare. Now, some of you might be asking, why doesn't God just deal with them directly? Why separate me instead of changing them? And the answer is brutally simple. Because you're the one who can be changed. You're the one who can still be saved, healed, redeemed. The narcissist has chosen a path, and they've hardened themselves against correction. You were crying out, even if you didn't know it. You were whispering those prayers in the dark. You were begging for relief, and God heard you. He answered not by softening their heart, that's their responsibility, but by pulling you out of the fire before it consumed you. And the process of separation is terrifying because it often looks like loss. You lose the relationship. You lose the dream you had of what it could have been. You might even lose friends, family, a community that was built around that toxic bond. You're standing there thinking, God, why am I losing everything? But you're not losing everything, you're losing the counterfeit. You're losing what was designed to keep you enslaved. Think about it this way. If you're carrying poison in your body and the surgeon comes along and cuts it out, it's going to hurt. You'll bleed. You'll feel weak. But the alternative is death. That's what divine separation is. It's surgical. It's painful. But it saves your life. And once you've been separated, you start to notice something strange. The air feels different. There's peace where there used to be chaos. There's clarity where there used to be confusion. You start hearing your own thoughts again. You start rediscovering who you are, not who they told you you were. And you realize you were never meant to carry their shame, their rage, their emptiness. You were never meant to be the sacrifice on the altar of their ego. This is why it's so important to acknowledge that separation as sacred. Because if you treat it like it was just a coincidence or just your own courage, you risk going back. And that's the danger. People go back to narcissists all the time because they forget what it took to get out. They forget that it wasn't their own strength, it was God's grace. And if you walk back into that cage after God pulled you out, the destruction is worse. Because now you know the truth, and rejecting that truth has consequences. So the separation is not just an escape, it's a call to wake up. It's a line in the sand, it's God saying, I've shown you who they are, and I've shown you who I am. Now you must choose. And if you choose wisely, you'll begin to see that what felt like devastation was actually deliverance. That what felt like punishment was protection. And here's the other side of it. The narcissist feels the separation too. To them, it's not just losing a partner, a friend, a family member. It's losing their anchor, their energy source, their mirror. It destabilizes them in ways they cannot articulate. And you leaving becomes the beginning of their unraveling. You don't always get to see it. Sometimes God shields you from it because the temptation to gloat or to re-entangle yourself is strong. But make no mistake, when God separates you, He also sets in motion the collapse of their carefully constructed illusion. So here's what I want you to grasp. If you've been separated from a narcissist, don't mistake it for abandonment. Don't mistake it for weakness. Don't mistake it for loss. It is evidence that the God of the universe reached into your life and said, "This one is mine. I won't let them be destroyed." That's not just separation. That's salvation. And once you recognize that, you stop mourning what was never real, and you start living in gratitude for what is real. The freedom, the peace, the ability to rebuild on a foundation that won't crumble under the weight of lies. You begin to realize that the scariest thing is not the end of a narcissist's life. The scariest thing would have been if you stayed bound to them until your life ended alongside theirs. That's why separation matters. That's why it's sacred. And that's why you must never, ever mistake it for anything less than the direct hand of God moving in your story. Because the moment He separates you is the moment you start living again. The collapse of their false image, narcissists thrive on appearances, admiration, and control. After losing their target, their mask begins to fall off. The emptiness, exposure, and humiliation they face when the truth can no longer be hidden. You know, when you're dealing with a narcissist, one of the most shocking realizations you come to, especially after God has separated you from them, is just how much of their identity was a performance. Because while you were with them, you couldn't always see it. They were good at hiding it. They could charm, flatter, manipulate. They could project competence, even greatness. They wore that mask so convincingly that even you, the one closest to them, found yourself questioning your own instincts. But once you're out, once the fog lifts, you look back and you see it. You see how every smile, every compliment, every act of apparent generosity was staged. It wasn't real. It was bait. And you realize you weren't dealing with an authentic human being, not in the sense of someone striving toward truth and humility. You were dealing with an actor playing a role. And the role was designed to ensnare you. The collapse of that false image is inevitable once you're gone. Because you were their prop. You were the mirror they used to reflect their manufactured identity back to the world. You validated them, explained them, covered for them, helped polish the mask when it cracked. You gave them credibility just by standing next to them. And when you're no longer there, the mask doesn't shine the way it used to. Think about it. Imagine a stage actor in a massive theater. The lights are on, the costume is perfect, the makeup flawless. But what if there's no audience? What happens then? The performance loses meaning. It collapses under its own emptiness. That's what happens to the narcissist when God pulls you away. The show doesn't play the same without you in the seats, without you applauding on cue, without you gasping at the drama. And here's the part that cuts deep. They know it. They know, even if they never admit it, that their image depended on you, that the stability of their carefully crafted world was held together by your sacrifice, your energy, your willingness to suspend disbelief. So when you walk away, or when God removes you, it's not just a loss of supply. It's an exposure. It's the first crack in the mask. And once that mask starts to slip, they scramble. They try desperately to find new players for their stage. They'll latch on to new people, charm them, pull them in, hoping to rebuild the illusion. But here's the difference by this point. The performance is stale. It's desperate. It doesn't have the same conviction. Because deep down, they're exhausted. Maintaining an identity that isn't real drains a person. And when the primary witness to their act is gone, the hollowness becomes unbearable. Now, you might think, well, maybe they'll change once they're exposed. That's the hope we all cling to at some point. Maybe the collapse of their image will humble them, bring them back to reality. But in most cases, that's not what happens. Instead of turning inward and confronting the truth, they double down on the act. They patch the mask with even more lies, more theatrics, more manipulation. And the more they try to maintain it, the more absurd it becomes. You see, truth has this relentless way of breaking through. You can suppress it for a while. You can distract people with lights and noise and costumes. But eventually reality asserts itself. And when it does, it has no mercy for illusions. It tears them down, it reveals the scaffolding, it leaves the actor standing there, stripped of costume, exposed under the harsh light. For the narcissist, this exposure is torment, because they've spent their entire life avoiding that moment. They've built layer upon layer of identity, carefully protecting themselves from having to face their own emptiness. And now, suddenly, the people who used to believe them, who used to admire them, begin to see through the act. Maybe slowly at first, a raised eyebrow here, a moment of doubt there, but eventually the audience loses faith. And once that faith is gone, the performance collapses completely. And let me tell you something, that collapse is not quiet, it's not dignified, it's messy, it's angry, it's desperate. Because the narcissist doesn't just lose their false image, they lose control. And control is the one thing they crave above all else. So they thrash, they blame. They invent new stories, new villains, new excuses. They may even try to rewrite history to convince others and themselves that the collapse isn't real. But it doesn't matter. Once the mask is cracked, it can never be restored to its original state. And you, standing on the outside now, get to see the truth. Not because you wanted revenge, not because you went looking for it, but because exposure is the natural consequence of deception. You get to see how fragile the empire they built really was. How quickly the grandeur dissolves when there's no one left to hold it up. And you realize, perhaps for the first time, that you were never the weak one. You were the strong one. Because it took all of your strength to keep their illusion alive. And once you were gone, it couldn't stand on its own. Now, I'll tell you why this matters. Because the collapse of their false image is not just their downfall, it's your liberation. For as long as you believed the act, you were bound. You lived in confusion, self-doubt, constant questioning of your own worth. But once the mask falls, you see them for what they are. And in that clarity, you also see yourself differently. You see that you are not who they said you were. You are not the flawed, broken, inadequate person they projected onto you. You are someone who survived a performance designed to break you. That clarity, that vision, it changes you, it empowers you. It restores the dignity that was stolen. And it gives you the strength to never again be fooled by the mask of a narcissist. So, in the end, the collapse of their image is inevitable. It's painful for them, humiliating, terrifying. But for you, it's the beginning of truth. It's the moment when the light finally shines through the cracks, and you see with unflinching eyes that what once held you in chains was nothing more than smoke and mirrors. And that's when you know you're free. The isolation they cannot escape without their chosen victim, they struggle to find new supply. People begin to distance themselves, seeing through manipulation. They're once crowded, life often turns lonely and hollow. When the mask collapses, something else begins to happen, something even more terrifying for the narcissist. It's the isolation. And it's not just being alone in the ordinary sense. It's a kind of exile. It's the slow, inevitable realization that the very people who once applauded their act are no longer willing to play along. You see, the narcissist needs an audience the way a human being needs oxygen. They cannot survive without someone to feed off of, without someone to validate their lies, without someone to reflect their false image back to them. And at first, after God has pulled you away, they rush to replace you. They scramble, they scheme, they charm new victims. And for a time it works. They gather fresh admirers, new friends, maybe even another relationship. They'll appear as though nothing has changed, as though they've landed on their feet. But the truth is, it's never the same. Because the people they lure in now don't carry the same weight you once did. They don't know the whole story. They don't have the same history. And the narcissist knows this. Deep down, they feel it. They feel that the new supply doesn't patch the same hole. It doesn't silence the gnawing emptiness. And so the cycle becomes frantic, desperate. They move from one person to the next, one crowd to another, trying to rebuild what they lost. And here's the tragedy. They can't. Because once the original performance begins to crumble, word spreads. People start noticing the cracks. The whispers grow louder. Something's not right with them. Old lies come to light. Stories don't add up. And slowly, even the new admirers begin to distance themselves. They're not quite sure why. They just sense the darkness, the instability, the manipulation. And so they pull back. That's the beginning of isolation. It starts quietly. One person doesn't call back. Another stops responding. An invitation doesn't come. And for the narcissist, who once thrived on being the center of attention, that silence is deafening. It's unbearable, because what they fear more than anything isn't rejection, it's irrelevance. To be irrelevant, to no longer matter in the eyes of others, is like death to them. Now, think about the spiritual dimension of this. When God removes you, He's not just rescuing you, He's dismantling their empire, and part of that dismantling is this forced isolation. It's not an accident, it's not coincidence, it's judgment. It's the natural consequence of building a life on deception. Eventually the scaffolding collapses, and there's nothing left but them, standing alone, surrounded by the echoes of their own lies. And this is where the torment begins. Because narcissists don't do well with solitude. Normal people can be alone and find peace, reflection, even joy. But a narcissist, alone, they're confronted with themselves. And that is their worst nightmare. Because the self they've spent their entire lives hiding from is not glorious. It's not admirable. It's broken, empty, ashamed. And when there's no one left to project onto, no one left to blame, they're forced to look in the mirror. Now, most of them can't handle it. So what do? They numb themselves. They drown out the silence with distractions, addictions, affairs, workaholism, anything to avoid the confrontation. But none of it satisfies. It's like drinking salt water when you're thirsty. The more they consume, the more desperate they become. And the cycle spirals downward. You might wonder why this matters to you, since you're already free. And here's why: because understanding their isolation gives you perspective. It helps you see that leaving was not only necessary, it was inevitable. It helps you stop asking those questions that haunt so many survivors. Did I do the right thing? Could I have saved them? Could I have loved them enough to change them? The answer is no, because what they face now is not something another human being can fix. It's the consequence of choices they made long before you. And there's another truth here. Their isolation is also your protection. Because if they still had the power of community, of influence, of endless admirers, they'd come for you again. They'd try to drag you back into the performance. But once the audience is gone, their reach shrinks, their empire crumbles. And you're safer than you realize. But don't misunderstand me. Their isolation doesn't always look obvious from the outside. They may post pictures with new friends. They may show off a new relationship, new adventures, new successes. But all of that is smoke, because deep down they know those people don't really know them. Those relationships are shallow, temporary, built on the same lies that already failed once. And so, even surrounded by a crowd, they're alone. Perhaps more alone than they've ever been. And let me tell you something. There are few things more terrifying for a narcissist than being surrounded by people who don't truly see them, don't truly care about them, don't truly know them. Because their whole identity is built on control, and in that moment they realize they don't control anything. Not the people, not the narrative, not even themselves. So the isolation grows. It grows like a shadow. It follows them into every room, every new connection, every empty night. And it eats at them. That's the punishment. That's the consequence. It's not just that they lost you. It's that in losing you, they lost the illusion that they could ever escape themselves. And this is why, in the end, the isolation of the narcissist is the beginning of your freedom. Because the very thing they cannot escape, the loneliness, the silence, the irrelevance, is the very thing that protects you. It creates a distance between you and them that cannot be bridged. And while they rage and flail and try to rebuild their shattered empire, you are finally free to build something real. So don't pity them too much. Don't waste your tears on their loneliness, because that loneliness is the harvest of seeds they planted long ago. And don't envy their crowd, their apparent success, their glittering facade, because beneath it all, they're already in exile, already in isolation, already tasting the judgment of the life they chose. And that's something you never have to carry again, because while they're trapped in their own isolation, you're free. The spiritual reckoning, God's justice. You reap what you sow, the torment of a conscience that can no longer be silenced. How arrogance and defiance eventually lead to shame and despair. at some point, after the mask has collapsed and the isolation has set in, something much deeper begins to stir. And this is where it gets frightening, because it's no longer just about appearances or about losing relationships or even about being lonely. It's about the soul. It's about the reckoning. Because when you live a life built on deception, manipulation, and pride, you cannot outrun the spiritual consequences. Now, the narcissist has spent their entire existence avoiding responsibility. That's what the manipulation was for. That's what the projection was for. Every time something went wrong, it was someone else's fault. Every time they failed, it was because of another person. Every wound they caused, they blamed on the victim's weakness or oversensitivity. For years, sometimes decades, they can live this way, pushing away accountability. But there comes a point when reality catches up. It always does. And this is not merely psychological. It's not just about guilt or shame. It's spiritual. It's that universal law that says you reap what you sow. You cannot sow betrayal, cruelty, arrogance, and destruction and then expect to harvest peace. Eventually, the bill comes due, and when it does, it's terrifying. You see, the narcissist has been playing a dangerous game, not just with people, but with God. Because every lie wasn't just a lie against another human being, it was a rebellion against truth itself. Every manipulation wasn't just about getting their way. It was an assault on the dignity of another soul. Every act of pride wasn't just arrogance toward others. It was arrogance toward the Creator. And when you live in constant rebellion against God's truth, there is always a reckoning. Now, this reckoning doesn't usually happen all at once. It's not a lightning bolt from the sky. It's gradual. It begins with the knowing awareness that something is wrong. They try to silence it, of course. They'll drown it in alcohol, in relationships, in endless distractions. But the awareness grows. It whispers to them at night. It stares at them in the mirror. It creeps into their thoughts in those quiet moments when no one is watching. And what it says is this: you are guilty. You are empty. You are exposed. And that voice, that whisper, it's the voice they cannot silence. It's the truth they cannot run from. It's the weight of a conscience that has been suppressed for so long, finally breaking through. Now, for some, that reckoning could be redemptive. If they humbled themselves, if they confessed, if they turned toward the truth, there could still be forgiveness. But for most narcissists, that path is too humiliating. Their pride won't let them. They'd rather cling to the illusion, even as it crumbles, than bow to the truth. And so the reckoning becomes torment, because the conscience doesn't stop speaking just because you refuse to listen. It grows louder. It presses harder. And this torment begins to show in their lives. Their temper becomes more volatile. Their paranoia grows. They start to see enemies everywhere, even among those who still try to support them. Because when you've built your entire existence on lies, you begin to assume everyone else is lying too. You lose the ability to trust. And in that mistrust, you isolate yourself even further. That's the justice of it. You see, the very weapons they used on others, gaslighting, projection, blame, they now turn inward. They gaslight themselves, rewriting their own history, convincing themselves they were the victim. They project their own guilt onto others, lashing out at shadows. They blame everyone and everything until eventually there's no one left to blame but themselves. And that realization, when it finally breaks through, is unbearable. It's not just unbearable because of the shame. It's unbearable because it reveals the truth they've been running from all along, that without the mask, without the audience, without the control, they are nothing. And worse, they are accountable. Accountable to the people they harmed. Accountable to the truth they denied. Accountable to the God they defied. And here's where the real spiritual reckoning lies. It's not simply that they lose relationships or reputations or status. It's that they begin to see glimpses of eternity, and it terrifies them, because eternity is not built on lies, it is built on truth. And standing before truth with nothing but deception to show for your life is a dreadful thing. This is why you often see narcissists, toward the end, consumed by bitterness. They rage against everyone. They rage against the world. They rage against God himself. Because deep down, they know what's coming. They know the house of cards has collapsed, and there's no rebuilding it. They know they're standing in judgment already, not just in some distant future, but here and now. And it eats at them. Now, you might be tempted to think, good, they deserve it. And in a sense, yes, they do. But there's something tragic here too. Because the reckoning was never meant to be torment. It was meant to be a chance to wake up, to repent, to turn back. But pride won't allow it. And so what could have been salvation becomes judgment. What could have been redemption becomes condemnation. That's the scary end. Not just the loneliness, not just the collapse of their image, but the spiritual emptiness that no amount of charm or control can fill. They are left face to face with themselves and with God. And without the mask, without the lies, they are terrified of what they see. And that's why you must understand this, the separation that saved you wasn't only about protecting your life. It was about protecting your soul. Because had you stayed, you would have been dragged into that reckoning with them. You would have carried their guilt, their shame, their torment. But God pulled you out so that their judgment would not become your inheritance. So when you think back on what you lost, when you feel that tug of nostalgia or pity or doubt, remember this, what they face now is not yours to bear. Their reckoning is theirs alone. And you were spared. That is the justice. That is the mercy. That is the dividing line between their downfall and your deliverance. Because in the end, they cannot escape the truth. The emotional and mental breakdown rage turning inward when they no longer have someone to project onto. Fear, paranoia, and bitterness consume them. The self-destruction that often follows addiction's failed relationships or breakdowns. By the time the reckoning begins to take root, when the mask has collapsed and the isolation has wrapped around them like a prison, something inevitable follows. It's the breakdown. And I don't just mean a bad day or a rough season. I mean the unraveling of the mind and the emotions, the slow disintegration of the very self they worked so hard to protect. For years, maybe decades, the narcissist has lived by projection. Everything inside of them that was too ugly, too painful, too shameful, they threw it onto someone else. They accused you of being selfish when it was their selfishness. They told you that you were unstable when it was their instability. They convinced you that you were the problem, because admitting they were the problem was unthinkable. And in doing so, they kept themselves intact. They kept the illusion alive. But once you're gone, once there's no one left to absorb their poison, all of that darkness has nowhere to go. It turns inward. The rage they once aimed at you, they now feel burning in their own chest. The paranoia they once projected onto others, they now whisper to themselves in the dark. The shame they buried beneath layers of lies, it starts clawing its way to the surface. And without a scapegoat, without a target, they are forced to wrestle with it. And here's the frightening part. Most of them don't have the tools to handle it. Because they've spent a lifetime avoiding emotional responsibility. They've never learned to sit with guilt, to process grief, to confront fear. All they know how to do is deny, deflect, and destroy. And when that strategy stops working, when denial can't silence the voices and deflection can't shift the blame, they panic. That panic shows up in different ways. Some become consumed by anger, lashing out at anyone who crosses their path. Their rage grows so disproportionate that even casual encounters become battles. Others sink into depression, not the quiet sadness that brings humility, but a despair that corrodes everything. They become bitter, hopeless, empty. Some spiral into addictions, alcohol, drugs, gambling, sex, anything that promises escape, even for a moment. But no matter what they choose, the relief is temporary, because the enemy they're running from isn't outside anymore. It's inside. And here's what makes this breakdown especially cruel. They've built their entire lives on control. Control of their image, control of their environment, control of the people around them. But during the breakdown, they lose control, not to someone else, but to themselves. Their own thoughts become the tyrant. Their own emotions become the enemy. They try to dominate them the way they dominated others, but it doesn't work. You can't bully your way out of shame. You can't manipulate your way out of emptiness. You can't charm your way out of despair. So they spiral. Their nights are filled with restless thoughts. Their days with frantic attempts to appear normal. But the cracks keep showing. People notice the volatility. They notice the bitterness. They notice the sadness seeping through the performance. And slowly, even those who tolerated them before begin to drift away. The breakdown drives them deeper into isolation. And the isolation fuels the breakdown. It's a vicious cycle with no end in sight. Now, this is important to understand. Their breakdown is not your responsibility, because survivors often carry a strange guilt. You think if I'd stayed, maybe I could have held them together. Maybe they wouldn't have fallen apart like this. But that's a lie. They were already falling apart long before you left. You were just the one holding the pieces together. And when God pulled you away, he didn't create their collapse. He revealed it. He let the truth surface. And here's another thing. The breakdown is not always visible from the outside. They may still post smiling pictures, still show up at work, still host parties. But the real collapse is internal. It's in the sleepless nights, the compulsive behaviors, the gnawing dread they can't admit to anyone. And make no mistake, it's there. Because no one can live in constant contradiction, in constant denial of reality, without eventually breaking. And this is why the end of a narcissist's life is so haunting. It's not just that they lose people. It's not just that they face spiritual judgment. It's that their own mind turns against them. The fortress they thought would protect them becomes their prison. The strategies that once gave them power now leave them powerless. The very ego they worshipped becomes their executioner. There's a sobering lesson in this, because it shows us what happens when you spend a lifetime refusing truth. Truth doesn't go away just because you deny it. It waits. It lingers. And the longer you resist it, the heavier it grows, until finally it crushes you under its weight. That's the emotional and mental breakdown of the narcissist. It is truth long ignored, coming to collect its debt. And yet for you, witnessing this from the outside, the lesson is also liberating, because you see clearly that their collapse is not your collapse. Their torment is not your torment. You were spared so that you could heal, so that you could build, so that you could thrive. Their downfall does not have to be your destiny. So when you think back, when you remember the chaos you lived through, understand that what you experienced was only the surface of what was inside them all along. And had you stayed, that chaos would have swallowed you whole. But you didn't. You were separated. You were saved. And now, while they wrestle with demons of their own making, you are free to walk in peace. That is the great contrast at the heart of this story. Their breakdown is the evidence of their destruction, and your freedom is the evidence of your deliverance. And that's why, in the end, their rage, their despair, their collapse is not yours to carry. Because the mind that breaks under the weight of lies is not yours anymore. Your freedom and their warning, your healing and restoration as evidence of God's power. Their downfall serving as a cautionary tale of pride, manipulation, and rebellion against God. Encouragement to the audience, trust God's timing. He will always separate and protect his children. By the time the narcissist has reached the end of that road, the collapse of their image, the isolation they cannot escape, the reckoning of their soul, and the breakdown of their mind, something remarkable has already happened for you. Because while their life spirals downward, your life begins to rise. The separation that once felt like devastation becomes the soil of your freedom. And this, perhaps more than anything, is what makes the contrast so stark, so powerful, so undeniable. At first, you may not recognize it. You've come out of the chaos shaken, disoriented, scarred. You wonder who you are, because you've spent years being told who you were by someone who never saw you clearly. You feel weak. You feel uncertain. And it's tempting in those first fragile moments to look back, to question whether you've made the right choice, to wonder whether the cost of leaving was worth it. But slowly, sometimes so slowly you hardly notice, you begin to feel it. The air is lighter. The silence, once terrifying, becomes comforting. You start to hear your own voice again. You begin to trust your instincts, the ones you had been trained to ignore. And what grows out of that is something extraordinary. It's freedom. Freedom is not just the absence of control. It's not just walking away from the cage. It's the ability to live without fear, to speak without apology, to rest without guilt. It's the rediscovery of joy in small things, the laughter of friends, the warmth of a quiet evening, the peace of knowing you don't have to explain yourself to someone who never listened anyway. Freedom is what you were created for. And when God separated you, he gave you back that birthright. But here's the part that's hard to put into words. Your freedom is not just a gift for you. It's also a warning to them. Because every time they look at you thriving, healing, growing, they're confronted with the truth. They're confronted with the reality that all their power, all their manipulation, all their control failed. You got out. You survived. You're living proof that their dominion was never absolute. And that terrifies them. That's why they'll sometimes try to reinsert themselves into your life. Not because they love you, not because they've changed, but because your freedom exposes their failure. It shows them that their empire was built on sand. And so they'll test the waters. They'll send a message. They'll try to draw you back into the drama. But you don't belong there anymore. That chapter is closed. And every time you say no, every time you stand firm, your freedom becomes louder. It speaks not just to them, but to everyone around you. It says, this is what happens when truth wins. This is what happens when lies collapse. This is what happens when God intervenes. Your life becomes a living testimony, not just of survival, but of redemption. And if you think about it, that's the ultimate warning to them. Because the narcissist thrives on control, but in the end, their story serves a purpose they never intended. Their downfall becomes a cautionary tale. Their arrogance becomes an example of what not to become. Their collapse becomes the evidence of what happens when pride goes unchecked. You see, the world is watching both of you. It watches them unravel, consumed by the weight of their own lies. And it watches you rise, carried by truth and grace. And whether they admit it or not, they see it too. They see the contrast. They see the life you're building, the peace you've found, the light in your eyes. And it gnaws at them. Because deep down, they know it could have been different. They know that had they chosen humility, had they chosen truth, they might have shared in that freedom. But they didn't. And so your freedom becomes their reminder, a warning they cannot silence. But don't let their warning consume you. Don't waste your life staring back into the ruins of theirs. Because your story is no longer about them. It's about what comes after. It's about the rebuilding. It's about the people you'll meet, the dreams you'll pursue, the purpose you'll fulfill. It's about living in such a way that your past no longer defines you, but instead refines you. And that's the irony, isn't it? The narcissists spent their life trying to destroy you, to reduce you, to erase you. But in the end, they only revealed your strength. They only pushed you toward the God who saves. They only highlighted the contrast between what is false and what is true. And that truth has set you free. So don't fear their collapse. Don't pity their isolation. Don't carry the weight of their breakdown. Their story is their story. Yours is different now. Yours is one of freedom, of healing, of restoration. And every step you take away from their shadow is a step into the life you were always meant to live. That's the great reversal. Their end is tragic, but your future is hopeful. Their warning is sobering, but your testimony is inspiring. And in the end, the separation that felt like death was actually the beginning of life. So remember this, you were not just delivered from them, you were delivered for something. For joy, for peace, for truth, for love that isn't poisoned by pride, for a future that isn't shackled by lies. That's the gift of freedom. And once you've tasted it, you'll never go back. Because their end is their warning, but your life is your victory. Outro of this video